Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Time with Junebug. That's me. And it's been a while because instead of doing research for a new true crime, I decided to do research for lions, about man-eating lions, and force my husband to learn about them. So if you watched that, to one of you, 11 of you, thank you. So if you're wondering where true crime has been, it's because I was doing research on lions instead. No one really watches this channel. I can do what I want. So today we are going to talk about something that has taken place in my state, Michigan, in case you didn't remember. But unlike the other case I covered in Michigan, the Bath Bomb School Massacre, the Bath Bomb School Massacre, I didn't go visit the site. This one, of course, is a bit farther away, but also it'd be kind of weird to visit this site because today we are talking about the Ann Arbor hospital murders. So it would have been a bit weird for me to just go look at the hospital. So I didn't do that. No site visit with this true crime. So the Ann Arbor hospital murders, there's believed to be about 10 victims, and this takes place in the summer of 1975. Now I always say the ages of the victims in case anything with children bothers you, and all of these were adults, generally older adults. This obviously takes place in Ann Arbor, Michigan, hence the name, the Ann Arbor hospital murders, and its status is solved solely depending on who you ask. This is really it changes person to person. Like even the law seems to disagree on this case. So let's get into it. Now, for like a pop culture reference, there is like a podcast documentary at the same name, so Ann Arbor Hospital Murders, that came out in 2022 actually. And there is a book called Paralyzing Summer that came out in 2016 that was written by a doctor who actually worked at the hospital during the time of this incident. I also want to note before we dive too deep into it, there's not a ton to go off of, particularly for me because I obviously didn't read the doctor's book. And this also make it a bit confusing at times. I'm still slightly confused by some things when I was doing research, so that took me a bit longer getting the research for this. But just so you know, this may be a bit confusing, especially with my not wondrous storytelling capabilities. There are so many fuzzies. So let's set the scene. It's the summer of 1975 in Ann Arbor, Michigan, at a VA or Veterans Hospital. Now, during this time, many patients began suffering respiratory failure and also dying from those at a more frequent pace. Now, this could have been like a quote-unquote just rough summer, to put it lightly, I guess, until there was an event that drew a doctor's suspicion. Now, this event that made a doctor question what was happening, and I do want to know it's not the same doctor who wrote the book. Just want to put that out there. This event was three patients needed emergency treatment to save their lives, all from respiratory failures within 20 minutes of each other. That's a lot. That's probably very stressful, to say the least. Now, the head anesthesiologist, Dr. Ann Hill, I mentioned she was Irish born. Just figured I'd toss that in there. She was at all three resuscitations, and notice all these people were in a flaccid state, it was put. They also weren't breathing, but they all had a pulse. Now, this could be due, she theorized, due to a powerful muscle relaxant, because there's not many things from what I saw in the research that can create these type of side effects where you stop breathing but your pulse is fine. I don't want to say it's fine, but like everything has stopped functioning but your heart, essentially. Your brain's still working, but I think you know what I'm trying to say. Now, this test was like super fast because these are all in within 20 minutes, remember. She ran like a test real quick, and she realized at least the first patient had Pevulon. hopefully I'm saying that right, Pavilon in their system, which is a really, really intense muscle relaxer. So when she gave an antidote for the first patient for Pavilon, they started to recover. So when the next two patients in that 20-minute span had similar symptoms, she tried as well with the antidote for Pavilon, and they both worked. So all the patients were able to be fixed, quote unquote. Obviously, they aren't in a great state to begin with. That's why they're in the hospital. But the antidote for Pavilon solved the respiratory illness they were suffering in that moment. Now, Pavilon, which I'm really hoping I'm saying correctly because it's going to be mentioned a lot. It's, like I said, a very strong muscle relaxant. Now, it's a synthetic form. Pavilon is a synthetic form of a plant toxin used by some South Americans to poison the tips of their arrows. It's also used in putting animals down, and one of the drugs used for lethal injections, aka like putting someone to death. So it's super strong shit. So I was wondering, like, why is it even in the hospital? Because apparently, like, in very controlled, tiny amounts, it's used, I don't know about every time, but it's generally used when people go under to help their muscles relax, essentially. So this is pretty intense and not something people should just be having just in their systems randomly. So after discovering the situation where the anesthesiologist had to administer the antidote and it worked 3 times in the 20 minutes, she contacted the FBI. Well, I assume, contacted the police first, but due to a veteran hospital being a federal facility, the FBI got involved right away. Now, I do want to note that it said that after the FBI arrived, poisonings stopped. Never happened again. Now, this investigation would take a while. One source said about a year, which I feel like that's fast based off of other cases that will take like a decade. But that's more of like cold cases situation. But anyway, it would take a while due to numerous things. One, they're having to prove first that there was an actual crime and that people weren't just dying normally, quote unquote. Because most of these, if not all of these poisonings and respiratory failures took place in the ICU. So people having these respiratory failures weren't in the best of shape at all. So they had to prove it was a crime scene and not just these people passing because they're in the ICU. 2, for the patients who weren't able to be saved, they were obviously dead and buried. So they had to exhume and test these patients for Pavilon. 3, there actually wasn't a current test for Pavilon at this time, in deceased bodies at least. And it said like specifically like after embalming. I don't know if it meant like if you weren't embalmed and weren't super decayed, if they could find it in your system. But they didn't have a test for an embalmed deceased to see if it was in their systems. So they had to make the test first, which they did end up making one. And 4, they had to go through obviously all the hospital staff to like try to figure out who the suspect is or who suspects are. So like I said, they had to invent the test first for Pavilon in embalmed deceased bodies. So once the test was invented and they exhumed the bodies and tested them, traces of Pavilon were found in all of the bodies. Actually, my bad. Pavilon was found in nearly all of them, which is still a substantial amount. They also found a nurse who had been on duty for each and every one of the poisonings. This nurse was also identified by a patient who said she put something in his IV before he went into his respiratory failure. He was obviously one of the patients who survived. Now, her name is Filipina Narciso. And I do want to note that this particular patient who identified her would pass away before like the trial started, so he couldn't speak at the trial. Now, they have Filipina at the forefront. But another suspect would actually come to the forefront as well a little while later. Now, her name is Leonora Perez. Now, another patient, slash victim, came forward saying Perez tampered with his IV tube. Also, the son of another victim stated she was the one doing something to his father's IV when he came to visit him. He said he walked into his dad's room. The nurse, Perez, didn't notice him and she was busy tampering with his IV tube. And then soon after, his dad would go into a Pavlon-induced respiratory failure. Now, another note, the first patient I mentioned that ID'd Perez would also die before trial, so he could not speak at the trial. But the second patient, I don't know if he necessarily survived. I don't think he did, but his son, the one who ID'd Perez as well as tampering with his father IV, he would speak at the trial. Now, note, I am going to be jumping ahead now a bit due to there not being a ton of info. And the fact that most of the evidence is circumstantial. But the trial would start against these women in March of 1977. They were being charged with 10 counts of poisoning, 5 counts of murder, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder. And they did not have separate trials. I didn't see them mentioning it, but I don't think they thought the two women were working together. I don't think. But yet they still were tried in the same trial together. Now, this trial, it would be a long one. It ended July of 1977. When they said that, I was expecting it to be longer, but maybe for the 70s that was really freaking long. It was just March, April, May, June, July. 6 months is quite a long trial. So especially in the 70s, that might be long. So yes, it's a long trial, but it took, I saw 4 weeks alone to pick out a jury. Now the jury, they were warned it was a unique case. They were warned it could take a while and that nearly all evidence was circumstantial. So they had to be a bit picky with the jurors. Now this trial, besides them taking forever to pick their jury, would take a long time due to 1, the vastness of the case, 2, the slight language barrier because Filipina and Perez were from the Philippines. So there's a slight language barrier. There was the 2 people instead of just being 1 person on trial. That also slowed it down a bit. But then also the evidence, quote unquote, because it's a bit harder to go through a bunch of circumstantial evidence than what they call it, a smoking gun. So that was another reason it was slowed down. There was also, this had to take a while, obviously, 89 witnesses that were called to the stand on the prosecution side alone. And then the final big reason was, quote, and I'll link the article where I got a bunch of information, but the quote, the prosecution had to prove in each of the charged poisonings that the victim had been administered Pavlon within 3 minutes of the respiratory arrest and that Narciso or Perez was in close enough proximity to have administered during the interval, end quote. So it's just circumstantial evidence, basically, language barrier. This case took a while. Oh, also have to throw it in, they had to prove that no one else could have done it. It had to be these 2 ladies. Now, I honestly don't know a ton of detail about the trial. I didn't see a ton of detail about the trial, besides that it was long. They really emphasized that. I do know that both women, Filipina and Perez, would both testify. They would both be on the stand. And I know that helped a lot of the jurors decide their verdict. Let's just say it didn't make the ladies look good from what I could tell. Again, that could be due to the language barrier. That certainly didn't help. But them taking the stand, both of them did. I heard it wasn't great. They also, another interesting thing about this case is there was no known motive, but they also never I don't know if they didn't want to, but they never tried to find a motive for the poisonings. There was like the small theory that the nurses were understaffed and these nurses were trying to like send a message or something like, see, we're running around like chickens with their head cut off with all these respiratory failures or something, or they were maybe just trying to get rid of some patients. I don't know. It was just a small theory. I don't think it was ever like brought up in court, but just to throw it out there. It was also said this trial was marred by racism. Now, this is the mid-70s. Obviously, it's a different time than now, so that's part of it. But like I said, both of the women were Filipino immigrants. It said that the trial was just a bit racist. So when all was said and done, because remember, I don't have a ton of info, it took the jury 13 days to come to a verdict. And that verdict was that both nurses were guilty. Now, it is stated that some jurors thought they were innocent at first, and then they obviously changed their mind, and that was one of the reasons they took a bit longer to come to their verdict. I know that once the women took the stand, that pushed more of them to a guilty verdict. It said there was like contradicting information they discussed and just things like that. However, I do want to note they were not found guilty of all the original charges, because there was quite a lot. They were just found guilty, they were found guilty of 3 counts of poisoning and conspiracy to poison. So a much shorter amount of charges. So some public backlash, not all, but there was quite a bit a public backlash against this verdict. And due to this, a retrial was actually ordered. However, when a new U.S. attorney stepped in, he decided it's not necessary. Nah. So there was going to be a retrial, but then the new guy was like, I don't want to. He thought, like from what I saw online, that since so much of the public thought the nurses were innocent, because a lot of the public did think they were innocent, he said, and like the case is so very political, he's like, there's just no point. I guess I see his point, I guess. I don't know. This case confuses me. Now, both women did end up serving prison time, but when the retrial was denied or not going to happen, they were released and returned to their lives. And from what I saw, they have never spoken about the case since. Now, I know this case is a bit confusing. I warned that at the beginning. But it kind of seems to be what it's known for. Like I saw in one of the articles, that link I will link, that it was believed that sometimes, like newspapers and other sources, they had differing information. Sometimes sources would put out the wrong information. It got confusing and a bit messy, but nothing like this has happened at the hospital since that I've seen. Hopefully nothing has. So what do you guys think? Because I honestly do not know. I could very much see how they would be innocent, but at the same time, it's like, well, they got to this conclusion for a reason, and it is pretty damning that Filipina was at every single poisoning. Not like necessarily by the patient, but she was on every single shift. That makes me a bit nervous, but I really don't know. And then with like the racism back then, please tell me your thoughts, or if you happen to know more information, share it down below. Because this is not my best work. But it's just, I was trying to put this in a cohesive like timeline, and it was just, there's just gaps. But the next case I cover, which I've already started research on, it's going to be shorter and it's going to be a bit more cohesive. Also takes place in Michigan. Apparently I'm just on a roll with the Michigan cases right now. So please let me know what you think. If you were alive during this time, like tell me about the media surrounding this. And if there's anything I missed, please share it down below. See you next time. Bye guys.